Right now, across the United States, something massive is being built. Hundreds of identical buildings, windowless, humming, consuming power at a rate that would make a small city freak out. They're rising from farmland, desert, and quiet suburban communities at a pace never seen before in American infrastructure. These are data centers. And depending on who you ask, they are either saving the American economy or slowly destroying everything around them. In 2024, there were over 5,000 data centers in the United States. By 2030, that number could nearly double. And the companies behind them, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, are spending more money building these faculties than any corporations have ever spent building anything in history. Combined hyperscaler capital expenditure is projected to exceed $650 billion in 2026 alone. Over 4 years, the big 5 tech companies will have spent nearly $1.5 trillion on AI infrastructure. That's more than the interstate highway system, the Apollo program, and nationwide broadband deployment combined. But there's a cost. In Virginia, electricity prices surged 13% in a single year. In New Jersey, 21%. In Georgia, monthly power bills have risen 6 times in 2 years, now averaging $175 a month. A lifelong Republican cattle rancher in Georgia voted Democrat for the first time in his life over electricity bills tied to data centers. In the Dalles, Oregon, population 16,000, Google's data centers consume 434 million gallons of water in a single year. That's 33% of the entire city's water supply. In Newton County, Georgia, a single Meta facility uses 500,000 gallons of water every day. New proposals for the same county could use 6 million gallons daily, more than doubling the county's total consumption. Activist groups in 28 states are organizing. Moratoriums are spreading. $64 billion in projects have been blocked or delayed. In Ohio, a former Republican state lawmaker said he's never seen citizens so universally upset about anything. Loudoun County, Virginia, the data center capital of the world, ended by right zoning, now requiring public hearings for every new application. Google withdrew a $1 billion proposal from Indiana after community protests. So here's the question. Are data centers really draining our water, spiking our electricity bills, and destroying our communities, all to benefit a handful of tech billionaires? Or is the story a lot more complicated than the headlines suggest? Because here's what the headlines don't tell you. Without data center investment, the American economy in the first half of 2025 would have grown at just 0.1%, effectively a standstill. 92% of GDP growth came from this one sector. Harvard economists are calling it the only engine keeping this economy alive. And here's what nobody seems to want to talk about. China generates more than twice as much electricity as the United States. They added 429 gigawatts of new power capacity in a single year, 15 times the American pace. They have 80 to 100% reserve margins on their grid. American averages about 15, and they're building data centers fast, while we argue about whether to build any at all. This is the story of the most important infrastructure debate in America, and almost everyone is getting it wrong. So let's start with the water, because this is the issue that generates the most outrage, the most viral headlines, and, it turns out, the most misleading narratives. In 2023, all US data centers consumed approximately 17 billion gallons of water for cooling. 17 billion gallons. That sounds terrifying in isolation, and honestly, it should. 17 billion gallons of anything is a lot. But here's the thing about statistics. Without context, they're just numbers designed to make you feel something. So let's add some context. California's almond industry, just almonds, one crop in one state, consumes between 1.5 and 1.8 trillion gallons of water every single year. That's roughly 85 to 100 times more water than every data center in the United States combined. Almonds account for approximately 11% of California's entire developed water supply and use as much water as all California households combined. The Union of Concerned Scientists did the math. With all the water consumed by every data center in America, you could irrigate approximately 11,000 acres of almonds. California currently has 1.56 million acres of almonds planted. The entire data center industry's water footprint wouldn't even cover 1% of California's almond acreage. But almonds aren't the only comparison that makes data centers' water use look small. U.S. golf course irrigation uses over 500 billion gallons a year, roughly 29 times more than data centers. American lawn irrigation consumes over 2 trillion gallons annually, over 115 times more. Even in Maricopa County, Arizona, Phoenix, the middle of the desert, data centers account for just 0.12% of the total water use. Golf courses in the same county, 3.8%, 30 times more. And the biggest water use of all? Thermoelectric power plants. The plants generating the electricity for your house right now consume 962 billion gallons annually to evaporate losses. That is 56 times the data center total. Nobody's protesting outside your local power plant. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, fine, nationally it's small, but what about my community? And that's a fair point, because the honest truth is, the water debate isn't really about national totals. It's about concentrated local impact, and that's where the story gets more complicated. In the Dalles, Oregon, Google's data centers consume 33% of the city's water. Not the states, not the counties, the cities. In Newton County, Georgia, one meta facility uses 10% of the entire county's water. And here's something uncomfortable. Roughly 2/3 of data centers built since 2022 have been located in water-stressed regions. Hot, dry climates like Arizona, parts of Texas, and Nevada. Places that, from a purely hydrological standpoint, make no sense for facilities that need water to cool. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab projects that direct water consumption from data centers could double or even quadruple by 2028. A Texas study found data centers' water demand could reach 399 billion gallons by 2030, enough to draw Lake Mead down by 16 feet in a single year. So the critics aren't entirely wrong. The local impact is real. Siting decisions have been irresponsible, and people have every right to be concerned about their community's water supply. But here's what the doom and gloom narrative misses. The technology to solve this problem already exists, and it's being deployed at scale. Microsoft announced in 2024 that all new data center designs will use zero water for evaporative cooling, employing chip-level liquid cooling in closed loops. These systems save over 125 million liters per year per data center. Amazon uses treated reclaimed watershed at over 20 locations. Google uses recycled water at more than 25% of its campuses. The Stargate Project's facility in Abilene, Texas, estimates a water draw of just 12,000 gallons per year per building after the initial fill. Functionally, nothing. All 4 major hyperscalers have pledged to be water positive by 2030, meaning they'll return more water to stressed watersheds than they consume. Closed-loop cooling systems reduce freshwater consumption by 50 to 75%. The water narrative around data centers is disproportionate to the actual problem at a national level. Agriculture, golf courses, and lawns all dwarf data center water use by orders of magnitude. The local, concentrated impact is real, especially when facilities are built in water-stressed regions without proper planning. But the solution isn't to stop building data centers, it's to build them in the right places with the right technology. And the industry is already moving in that direction, faster than most critics acknowledge. But if the water concern is overblown, the energy concern is very, very real. And this is where the data center debate should actually be focused. In 2023, US data centers consumed approximately 176 terawatt hours of electricity. That's 4.4% of all electricity generated in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire electricity consumption of Pakistan, a country with 240 million people. And it's growing fast. That figure has tripled over the past decade. The Department of Energy projects data centers' electricity demand could double or triple by 2028, reaching 325 to 580 terawatt hours, somewhere between 7 and 12% of total US electricity. McKinsey projects data centers could reach 12% of US power consumption by 2030. Goldman Sachs estimates global data center power demand will grow by 165 to 175% by 2030. AI is the primary accelerant. A standard Google search uses about 0.3 watts of electricity. A ChatGPT query, 2.9 watt hours, 10 times more. Advanced reasoning models like O3 and DeepSeek R1 can consume over 33 watt hours per long prompt, more than 70 times a basic AI response. AI-specific server racks draw 3,000 to 5,000 watts or more, compared to 300 to 500 watts for traditional servers. This isn't hypothetical grid strain, it's already happening. In PJM interconnection territory, the grid servicing 67 million people across 13 states, data centers are responsible for 94% of projected peak load growth of 32 gigawatts between 2024 and 2030. PJM capacity auction prices have hit record highs, adding an estimated $9.4 billion in electricity costs for just the 2025 to 26 period. The National Resources Defense Council estimates the public could pay over $100 billion through 2033 in data center-driven cost increases. In Virginia, data centers consume more than 25% of the state's electricity. Dominion Energy faces 4,000 megawatts of new data center load by 2028, and the state already imports 40% of its power. A Carnegie Mellon study estimates electricity bills in central and northern Virginia could rise by 25% or more. But here's the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. The American energy grid was already in crisis before a single AI data center was ever built. Approximately 70% of the US grid is approaching end of life. Most of it was built between the 1950s and 1970s. The American Society of Civil Engineers grades our energy infrastructure at D+. Power outages already cost the US economy $150 billion every year. Before data centers, Edison Electric Institute projects $1.1 trillion in new grid investment is needed over the next 5 years, whether or not a single new data center is built. This subject matter can be hard to digest, but for most Americans, their personal financial situation is the hardest subject to approach and manage. But with the DollarWise budgeting app, you can finally take control, and since there's a free trial, you can see for yourself, get a full picture, automate your budget, get powerful insights, and set real goals that change your life. Download DollarWise or go to dollarwise.com. America's electricity demand was essentially flat for nearly 12 years. We stopped investing in the grid because nobody was asking us to. And now the grid is old, brittle, and unprepared for any kind of demand growth, not just from data centers, but from electric vehicles, heat pumps, manufacturing reshoring, and population shifts. Data centers didn't create the grid crisis, they exposed it. And paradoxically, they might be the thing that finally forces us to fix it. Because what's happening right now in American energy is nothing short of extraordinary. Tech companies, frustrated with waiting 3 to 5 years for grid connections, are doing something nobody expected. They're resurrecting the American nuclear industry. Microsoft signed a 20-year power purchase agreement with Constellation Energy to restart 3 Mile Island Unit 1. 835 megawatts of carbon-free power, now renamed Crane Clean Energy Center. The $1.6 billion restart is running ahead of schedule, backed by a $1 billion Department of Energy loan. Amazon expanded its nuclear portfolio dramatically. A 1,920 megawatt power purchase agreement with Talon Energy from the Susquehanna nuclear power plant, plus funding for 320 megawatts of small modular reactors with X Energy, expandable to 960 megawatts. Google struck the world's first corporate deal for a fleet of small modular reactors with Kairos Power. 500 megawatts by 2035 using innovative molten fluoride salt-cooled technology. It's the first Generation 4 reactor permitted in the United States in 50 years. Meta signed an 1,100 megawatt nuclear power purchase agreement with Constellation and issued a request for proposals seeking 1 to 4 gigawatts of new nuclear generation. NuScale received standard design approval for its 462 megawatt reactor. Oklo has a 14 gigawatt customer pipeline and broke ground on its first facility in Idaho. Oracle is building permits for 3 small modular reactors. Switch contracted for 12 gigawatts from Oklo. These aren't press releases, they're binding multi-billion-dollar commitments. Meanwhile, natural gas is serving as the realistic near-term bridge. Oracle partnered with Volta Grid for a 2.3 gigawatt modular gas fleet. Interconnection requests for gas generators jumped nearly 160% year over year. Data center operators are increasingly building on-site generation, bypassing the grid entirely, because the average wait time for grid connection in primary markets now exceeds 4 years. Microsoft signed a $6 billion deal for renewable-powered AI infrastructure. Brookfield and Bloom Energy established a $5 billion financing facility for on-site fuel cells. The Trump administration's July 2025 executive order on data center permitting directs agencies to update the electricity grid and streamline permitting for AI infrastructure. The US has been flat on electricity demand growth for nearly 20 years. Data centers are forcing the first major grid investment cycle in a generation. Rather than viewing this as a crisis, this is an opportunity to modernize aging infrastructure that was going to need replacement regardless. The energy problem is real, but it's not a data center problem. It's an infrastructure problem. And for the first time in decades, someone is actually willing to pay to fix it. Now let's talk about what data centers actually do for the American economy. Because the numbers here are staggering, and not enough people understand just how dependent US economic growth has become on this single sector. Harvard economist Jason Furman, analyzing Bureau of Economic Analysis data, calculated that 92% of US GDP growth in 2025 was attributable to data center and information processing investment. Let that sink in. Without tech infrastructure spending, annualized GDP growth would have just been 0.1%, effectively a standstill. The American economy in its current form is running on data centers. Renaissance Marco Research estimated that the dollar value contributed to GDP by AI data center build-out surpassed the total US consumer spending for the first time ever. That's remarkable, considering consumer spending is 2/3 of GDP. As one Fortune writer quipped, our economy might just be 3 AI data centers in a trench coat. The capital expenditure numbers are unprecedented in the history of corporate investment. Amazon's capital spending went from $54 billion in 2023 to a projected $200 billion in 2026. Google went from $32 billion to $185 billion. Microsoft from $44 billion to $120 billion. Meta from $28 billion to $115 to $135 billion. Combined, these companies are expected to spend between $600 to $635 and $665 billion in 2026. At roughly 1.9% of GDP, big tech capital expenditure now rivals the combined scale of the interstate highway system, the Apollo program, and nationwide broadband deployment. PwC's 2025 impact study found that the U.S. data center industry contributed $727 billion to GDP in 2023. Up from $355 billion in 2017, a 105% increase. The cumulative GDP contribution from 2017 to 2023 was $3.46 trillion. For every dollar directly contributed, $2.50 is generated elsewhere in the economy. The local tax story is best illustrated by Loudoun County, Virginia, the world's densest data center market. Data centers generated $875 million in tax revenue in fiscal year 2024, exceeding the county's entire general operations budget, while occupying just 3% of land. The assessed value of data centers surged nearly 79% in a single year to $42.4 billion. The county has used this revenue to build 36 new schools and invest $1 billion in road improvements over 15 years, while cutting the tax rate every year from $1.14.5 to 80 cents per $100 of assessed value, the lowest in Northern Virginia. The industry directly employed over 600,000 workers in 2023 and supported 4.7 million total jobs, including indirect and induced effects. Median data center worker salaries runs between $98,000 and $103,000. Technician compensation jumped 43% in just 3 years due to AI demand. Data center managers earn roughly $137,000 to $145,000. Construction employment is substantial. Each large facility employs up to 1,500 workers. Now, here's where I have to be honest, because data center advocates sometimes oversell the job story. Data centers themselves create relatively few permanent positions. A $10 billion facility might employ only a few hundred workers long term. The Stargate project in Abilene, Texas requires 1,500 workers to build, but will employ only about 100 to operate. NPR reported on Mississippi communities where $10 billion projects were announced with enormous construction workforces but modest permanent employment. The honest framing is this: data centers are excellent tax revenue generators and economic catalysts, but they're not mass employers. The indirect effects, construction, infrastructure, supply chain, tax revenue, are substantial. But if your community is hoping for thousands of permanent jobs, that's not what a data center does. What they deliver is money, and a lot of it. And if that money is well spent, whether on schools, roads, or services, the community wins, but only if the deals are structured right. And everything we've discussed so far, water, energy, economics, all of it sits inside a larger context that most people don't think about when they hear the words data center. And that context is national security. The United States currently leads the global AI infrastructure race. We have over 5,000 data centers and 44% of global hyperscale capacity. China has fewer facilities, around 450, but much larger ones, accounting for 16% of hyperscale capacity. On paper, America is winning. But the alarming gap isn't in data centers, it's in the ability to power them. China has 3,200 gigawatts of installed generation capacity compared to America's 1,293. In 2024 alone, China added 429 gigawatts of new capacity, 15 times the American pace. China maintains a reserved margin of 80 to 100%. US regional grids average roughly 15%. China generates more than twice as much electricity as the United States and has increased total power generation by nearly 6% per year over the past decade. Over half of that growth has come from clean energy sources. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang put it bluntly: building a data center in the US takes about 3 years from groundbreaking to operation. In China, he said, they can build a hospital in a week. A Brookings Institute noted that China's ability to build things quickly without the pressures of public opposition is a genuine strategic advantage. China is in the habit of building electricity generation to meet growing demand. The United States is just now growing again after being flat for nearly 20 years. China views this as an existential race. A Strider Technologies report warned that China has built or announced plans to build more than 250 AI data centers across all regions of the country. Chinese tech companies are investing aggressively. Alibaba committed over $50 billion to cloud and AI infrastructure over 3 years. ByteDance invested approximately $20 billion in GPUs and data centers. The Chinese government announced a $138 billion venture capital guidance fund for AI and quantum technology. And the DeepSeek R1 model achieved performance comparable to leading American models at a fraction of the cost, proving that Chinese AI capacity is advancing rapidly even under export controls. But China's strategy goes beyond its own borders. China is pursuing a complementary approach of investing in energy infrastructure globally, from solar plants in Saudi Arabia to offshore winds in Laos, while Chinese cloud providers like Alibaba and Huawei build data centers worldwide. By offering both energy and AI infrastructure solutions, China is positioning itself to control networks and data flows across what some strategists call the New South, energy-rich developing nations that are becoming pivotal in the AI era. And here's the strategic tension that makes this so complicated. The United States largely controls the supply of the most important AI chips, but China largely controls the supply of renewable energy products, solar panels, and batteries, that are the fastest way to produce those chips. America has the brains, China has the electricity. Whoever solves their weakness first wins. And the Middle East has emerged as a major battleground. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund subsidiary, Humain, unveiled a $77 billion infrastructure strategy targeting nearly 2 gigawatts of data center capacity by 2030. The UAE announced a 5 gigawatt AI campus spanning 10 square miles in Abu Dhabi, the largest AI infrastructure project outside of the United States, with electricity rates 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour, a fraction of the US prices. The American response has been the Stargate project, announced by President Trump in January 2025. $500 billion in planned AI infrastructure investment over 4 years, with $100 billion deployed immediately. Sites are operational or under development in Texas, New Mexico, Ohio, and the Midwest, with international expansion planned for the UAE, Argentina, the UK, Norway, and Japan. The Trump administration issued 3 simultaneous executive orders in July 2025 to accelerate federal permitting, promote AI exports to allies, and direct federal agencies to offer land and financial support for qualifying projects. The Department of Energy designed sites at Idaho's National Lab, Oak Ridge, Paducah, and Savannah River for public-private AI data center and energy projects. Take a moment and get some free, easy money. With a Chime checking account and my link, you can get $350 when you set up direct deposit and pair that with a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. There's literally no reason not to sign up right now. Chime.com/Caleb or link in the description below. The national security argument is not abstract. The Joint Warfighting Cloud Capacity Contract, worth up to $9 billion, provides cloud services to the military across all classification levels. When Russian missiles targeted Ukrainian command infrastructure, Kyiv's ability to migrate intelligence and targeting data to cloud systems proved operationally decisive. The Foreign Policy Research Institute warned that failure to treat data and data centers as national defense assets is a strategic blind spot, noting that a single AWS outage in October 2025 triggered 6.5 million website outages. The question is not whether we can afford to build data centers, the question is whether we can afford not to. And here's something that will surprise you if you're used to thinking about political issues on a left-right spectrum. The data centers debate doesn't fit neatly into either camp. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's national interests versus local interests. And the politics are genuinely chaotic. Data Center Watch found that 55% of public officials opposing data center projects were Republicans, 45% were Democrats. This is a local impact issue, not an ideological one. The 2025 elections made that crystal clear. In Virginia, Abigail Spanberger won the governorship, pledging to ensure data centers pay their way. A Democratic House of Delegates candidate unseated a Republican incumbent by campaigning against data center expansion in Loudoun County. In Georgia, 2 Democrats won seats on the Public Service Commission for the first time since 2007, propelled by anger over rising electricity costs. In New Jersey, the governor-elect pledged to declare a state of emergency over electricity bills. In Ohio, multiple local moratoriums passed. Former Republican state lawmaker Gene Krebs said he'd never seen citizens so universally upset. And here's the detail that should concern the White House. The overwhelming majority of data center cancellations came in states that Trump won in 2024, suburban and exurban areas that fueled his victory. Polling data for Progress found that 56% of voters support data center construction, with Republicans showing the strongest support at plus 36 points, followed by Democrats at plus 17 and Independents at plus 14. But support drops after voters learn about environmental impacts. And critically, opposition messages focused on economics, rising electricity costs, tax breaks for corporations, are far more effective than environmental messages. Among independents, 50% agree with economic opposition arguments versus only 29% for pollution-based arguments. Separately, 70% of Americans said they're comfortable with data centers within a few miles of their home, and 63% would accept one within a mile if it improves internet reliability and creates jobs. Florida's rural Southwest showed particularly strong support, voters backing data centers by nearly 3-1, driven by chronically economic instability in areas with poverty rates 50% higher than state urban centers. The Trump administration is navigating a difficult balancing act. In January 2026, the White House convened governors from both parties to develop a draft compact requiring data center developers to pay 100% of the cost of new power generation, sign long-term electricity contracts, and pay full costs of transmission upgrades. Companies must work with regulators too, quote, in every manner possible, hold harmless and ideally reduce residential electricity prices, a senior White House official stated plainly. We're going to support data centers, but not at the price of raising costs for consumers. Microsoft has already responded, preemptively committing to paying more for electricity serving its own data centers, covering infrastructure costs, reducing water consumption, and no longer accepting local tax breaks. Texas passed SB 6 with bipartisan votes, requiring data centers to curtail operations during high grid demand. Multiple states are creating dedicated rate classes for larger data centers to insulate residential consumers from price increases. The emerging consensus across party lines is pragmatic. Data centers should pay their own way, protect residential ratepayers, and share the benefits with host communities. It's not anti-business, it's anti-free ride. But while America debates, the rest of the world is actually solving these problems, and some of the solutions are surprisingly effective. The Nordic countries prove that data centers and environmental responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland collectively generate over 90% of their electricity from renewables and achieve power usage effectiveness ratios below 1.1 compared to the global industry average of 1.5 to 1.6. Finland offers over 8,000 hours of free cooling annually. A 10 megawatt data center in Finland uses just 10 to 20 cubic meters of water versus tens of millions of liters in hot climates. Stockholm's data center waste heat warms 30,000 apartments. Microsoft's facility in Espoo, Finland, will heat 100,000 homes. Ireland is a cautionary tale, but also a story of adaptation. Data centers now consume 22% of Ireland's national electricity, up from 5% in 2015. A 530-point increase. They use more electricity than all urban households combined. Ireland imposed a de facto moratorium on new Dublin data center grid connections in 2021, then lifted it in December 2025 with strict conditions. Operators must install on-site generation matching full demand, provide power back to the grid when needed, and source 80% of annual energy from new renewable projects. Singapore imposed a moratorium in 2019. Lifted it in 2022 with a selective approval regime and efficiency caps. The result? It actually created value, filtering for quality operators and establishing sustainability baselines. Germany's Energy Efficiency Act mandates 100% renewable energy for data centers by January 2027, and effectively ratios of 1.2 or lower for new facilities. The lesson from around the world is clear. Outright restriction doesn't work. Amsterdam's moratorium just pushed investment to competing cities. But thoughtful regulation that requires clean energy, efficiency standards, and community benefit, that elevates the entire industry. The countries doing it right aren't choosing between growth and sustainability. They're demanding both. So where does this leave us? Looking at the data, the politics, and the global competition, there are really three possible futures for American data center development. Path 1, restriction. Moratorium spread, opposition wins. The 230-plus organizations calling for a nationwide pause gets their way. Construction slows dramatically. The $64 billion in blocked projects becomes hundreds of billions. Capital flows to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and, most importantly, China. The United States maintains a clean environmental conscience, and within a decade, it falls permanently behind in AI capacity, losing the technological edge that has underpinned American economic and military power since World War II. This has happened before. Countries that underinvested in infrastructure paid lasting penalties. Africa's infrastructure deficit reduces annual economic growth by 2 percentage points and business productivity by up to 40%. This path feels good in the short term. It's catastrophic in the long term. Path 2. Unrestricted growth. Tech companies build wherever they want, however they want. No guardrails on water, no protections for ratepayers. Communities bear the cost while billionaires reap the profits. Electricity prices surge. Aquifers in arid regions are stressed to breaking points. Public backlash intensifies until the political pressure becomes overwhelming, leading to an even harsher overcorrection down the road. This is the path of short-term gains and long-term instability, and it's the path that gives the moratorium crowd their strongest argument. Path 3, build smarter. This is the path that actually works, and pieces of it are already falling into place. Data centers pay their own way, 100% of power generation costs, and 100% of transmission upgrades, no socialized burden on residential ratepayers. The White House Compact is directionally correct here. Companies cite facilities in water-abundant, cooler regions and mandate closed-loop cooling. Stop building in the Arizona desert when Finland exists. Massive investment in the grid. Natural gas as the realistic near-term bridge. Nuclear, including small modular reactors as the long-term real answer. And renewables plus shortage filling the gaps. And all of the above energy policy that treats this as it is. That treats this what it is, a national infrastructure priority on par with the interstate highways and the electrical grid itself. Transparency becomes mandatory. Companies disclose actual water and energy use by facility. Public trust requires public data, and communities negotiate real benefit agreements, not just tax revenue, but clean energy commitments, water caps, and annual payments. Colorado, Virginia, Michigan, and Washington State are already pioneering versions of this approach. Colorado requires large data centers to generate or purchase 100% of renewable energy by 2031. Virginia requires data centers to pay 85% of power line costs and 60% of generation costs. Michigan conditions tax exemptions on receiving 90% of electricity from clean energy. Cedar Rapids, Iowa negotiated a community benefit agreement with Google including water caps, clean energy requirements, and $400,000 annually in community payments. Every transformative American infrastructure build-out has faced fierce opposition before proving essential. The railroads were denounced as corporate welfare. Regions without rail connections fell permanently behind. The interstate highways were criticized as ruinously expensive. The internet backbone was dismissed as a speculative bubble. Data centers are this generation's transformative infrastructure. They consume 0.01% of American water for cooling and roughly 4.4% of electricity. They contribute $727 billion to GDP, support 4.7 million jobs, and generate tax revenue that funds schools, roads, and public services in communities across the country. The water problem is being solved. The energy problem requires investment that America needs regardless. The geopolitical stakes are existential, and the American contribution is not theoretical. It is measured GDP. Without it, the American economy is barely growing. The question was never whether data centers are bad. The question is whether America is smart enough to build them right. Because if we don't build them at all, someone else will, and they won't ask anyone's permission.